Well, ladies and gentlemen, delighted to be here. May I first of all, on behalf of all of you and myself, deeply appreciate the initiators of this idea of Think50. I see one of them here, Drs. Dearlove and Krainer. I think it's a great concept, starting in the US and moving on here. And also thank Amit Kapoor for putting together this fantastic collection, and it's highly enlightening listening to every speaker. The first communication from Amit mentioned the idea of India. So I built my presentation around that idea of India and not about the Indian philosophy and those aspects. Actually, they have to be a small part of the total picture. Management, I believe, is a global science and relevant to all countries. Well, this is just the context. I have divided my presentation into 5 parts. How the idea of India itself has been evolving over the last 66 years, since 1947. And it will continue to evolve in the future as well. Already some of you have been talking about the dream, the kind of India you would like to see, quite rightly. And I wanted to connect management to this idea of India. So that's the topic on my first frame. Yeah, okay. The interface of management and the idea of India, and how the dynamics of this interface has evolved over the last 66 years. Okay. Now, I'd like to give my view of the scorecard, and you will have your own. And these are things that naturally we will argue about. And there are tremendous challenges, some of which have been mentioned earlier today. And these are comparative challenges in the international arena. And finally, is there some way forward? The point that Vineet Nair made about what we can do, and quotations like Kennedy's famous speech, what you can do for the country. So let me take up the first idea of India. Yeah, this is a skip a beat. Okay. I think the single most important influence on the idea of India has been historically Nehru. Because he was in power for a long time, 17 years, also that he was involved in the freedom struggle, and he was a very bright intellect, student of history, the glimpses of world history, and deeply thought about India, his own rediscovery of India, and those who win write history. So he has influenced this. For him, what were the key elements, key points of his vision? He set a great store on democracy. There was argument about whether you can give universal adult suffrage to a country where the literacy was 10% at that time. But he made a distinction between formal education and wisdom and judgment of people, and took the huge risk of going for universal adult suffrage, electoral democracy. It has not been without problems. There have been a great deal of manipulations in elections until we had a civil servant in the form of Session. Many of you will remember as election commissioner. And I think since then we have been continuously improving the reliability of the electoral process. And India is now a country where many other countries are seeking the help of our election commission to conduct their own elections. The second major idea of Nehru's concept of India was secularism. To him, the idea of a nation based on religion or any kind of single ethnicity was anathema, and he would not have liked partition, but he would rather have an India where it can be secular, even if it loses some part of the territory and population. And in terms of international relations, having looked at imperialism, colonialism, exploitations of various kinds, in his own mind, he was very clear that India had to be non-aligned. Over a period of time, we have seen that this policy had its relevance at some point of time, but less and less relevant, multiple alignments, different kinds of strategic partnerships. This is changing, but at that time, it was a dominant idea. And also for him, his religion was science, the scientific temper. And he had the courage or the temerity at that time to debunk a whole lot of religion, Hinduism, Varanasi, various practices, and his favorite words were the completely unscientific, the antediluvian the ideas of many in India at that time. I think in the long run, the more fundamental influence which is reasserting itself, although Nehru was dominant in the first 30, 40 years, Gandhi's vision of India, and indeed the world, is showing its fundamental deep strength and capability. Gandhi was not in favor of a very strong state, a federal government. Nehru had relatively more of the Soviet model of development. It has its merits. A strong government, a planning commission, a structure, command. He regularly wrote letters to the chief ministers of the various states. Gandhi believed much more in a decentralized, his romantic idea, which was not entirely practical, of village democracy, but certainly loosely governed and much more autonomous. Gandhi was also very much on this inclusive theme, which is now coming back into currency in the last few years. The Aam Aadmi, one of the reasons why NDA lost the 2004 elections. And Gandhi's one central question, all of you would remember, any action that you want to take, look at what will it mean for the poorest India. So inclusive. Globally, there is this concern about inequality. In the United States, almost there is a kind of a hopelessness about reducing this inequality. The place where you're born, the family into which you are born, very strongly correlates with what you can earn and achieve in the rest of your life. And this is a problem that will build up worldwide. Gandhi was one of the early green thinkers in the world and worldwide today. In fact, he is revered more abroad than here, but I think we have the opportunity to build his vision into our idea of India. And what's relevant for business and management is Gandhi placed a great deal of stress on trusteeship. Nehru and his fellow socialists were to some extent almost anti-business. They allowed the private sector in the industrial policy resolution only because the state could not do everything. And there has been this discussion between him and J.R.D. Tata at that time. And Nehru has been quoted as having said that profit is a dirty word and he dislikes it. These two are very well known. There was a third, very charismatic leader who I think has not been fairly treated in Indian history, but some of his ideas of India are relevant. They are finding their way. He would have been shattered even more than Gandhi and Nehru about the partition. The INA, the Indian National Army that he built in Singapore, which came up to the border of Burma, was a completely secular army. All the songs in Urdu are highly inspiring. And if only he had lived, M.J. Akbar's book about him talks about if he had succeeded Nehru as Prime Minister, what the country might have seen. There was enough age difference between them, and it would have been a fantastic leadership talent of Bose following Nehru. For Bose, the key thing was to keep the country united, together. And in a way that has succeeded. India has seen the problems of Nagaland, Kashmir, Dravidistan, several parts which at one point or the other wanted to break. And I believe that we have a civil government and army that not an inch of territory can go out of this country. And the problem with Maoists will be dealt with. Subhash believed very much in a planned economy. He was even more of a socialist than Nehru was at that time. And he was a very strong nationalist. He's learning from Germany and Japan. He at that time didn't know perhaps about the Holocaust and the other horrors of it. He would have certainly condemned it. But he was a very strong nationalist in the sense of building the strength and capability of India. Now, since that initial pre-independence, highly dedicated leadership thrust, naturally, as history goes, there will be dilution. There will be some kind of various kinds of influences, corrosion will take place. And we have gone through cycles of pragmatism and ideology. And I think we are now in one phase of ideology back again since 2004. And there is this debate about welfare spending, very high fiscal deficit, and what it does to the economy, the rupee, and the current account deficit as well. Now, 1991 popularized this mantra of LPG. Some of you here may remember. The reforms of 1991 had three dimensions, all of which have not proceeded well, but some have relatively proceeded better than the others. They are changing the idea of India to the extent they succeed. L stands for liberalization. This is relatively the easier thing to do, liberalizing the domestic economy from excessive state control. But even this is not adequate. The land bill, the difficulties in acquiring the various facilities, infrastructure, connections. The other element which has progressed to some extent is G for globalization. I think the Indian economy was too close for a long time, and the trade intensity was very poor between import-export as part of the total GDP. We have substantially raised it now, more than 40%. But even here, as Pankaj Gemawat points out in his book, India has been one country which has had rethinking on this issue of globalization, going slower. But the slowest progress in these three is on P, which is privatization. When I was chairman of the Telecom Restructuring Committee in 1991, the thing we strongly recommended to government was done last. It has still not been fully completed. The easier things get done first, naturally, politically convenient things. While the DOT monopoly was kept going with 500,000 employees, at least the government allowed the private sector to come in. That is what has caused the mobile revolution. There is no more revolution in the landline. The landline is being displaced by mobile, fortunately. So there, new technology, equipment, collaborations could come in and change it. But the same kind of reform which took place in telecom infrastructure has not taken place in power, in airports, ports, many other areas that we need. So there are periods where, if, for example, the Gujarat riot had not taken place in 2002, and the Vajpayee administration or the NDA had come back, I think ministers like Arun Shourie might have taken privatization much further. And I think liberating it, there's nothing wrong with the public sector managers. One-to-one, they're equally talented. It is a system, it is a control. And all those public enterprises which have had some shares listed already have shareholder and market feedback. Wherever they are competing with private sector, domestic and global, they're performing better. And there are a number of examples here. Now, what has been the response of Indian management thought to the needs of the country? I decided to come back in 1967 from the US, so I chose India as my karma bhumi. Therefore, at that time, it appeared to us in IIM Calcutta, where I was, and Ahmedabad, which was the two only institutes of management at that time, that we have to begin by applying already available knowledge here. There is a huge backlog of knowledge and skills and tools which are available. Let's put it to action. That is the immediate need of the country. Because we were a primarily non-competitive, closed, planned, license permit Raj economy at that time, the focus of much of our management thinking and action was internal within the organization. Therefore, it was on organization behavior, as Harvard would call it, behavioral science, as MIT and IIM Calcutta would call it, organization development. These were the main things in that period. Now, the 1977 election made some change, although they did not go back to the 1959 Swatantra Party program. The Swatantra Party program was in fact the 1991 reforms, precisely what they were campaigning. They were far ahead of their time. But at least here there was some liberalization for domestic national capitalism, although George Fernandez was very hard on IBM, Coca-Cola and MNCs, as Arvind said earlier today. This government was in favor of domestic capital, except that they were a bit romantic. They were in support of medium and small sector rather than the large sector. But I think there was some move away from excessive state ownership of the economy. And therefore, there was some reason for domestic strategy. Some domestic competition was beginning to build up. And also beyond OD, the thinking moved on to human resource development, on the individual, on the teams, not only their behavioral aspects, but job-related skills and competences. These kinds of thoughts came up during this period. Good work by Uday Parikh, Ishwar Dayal, T.V. Rao, and many others in this field, my own colleagues, Dharani Sinha. 1991 began another phase which was going reasonably well till 2007. And I think during this period we saw the historical strength of India coming up, the DNA of entrepreneurship which is in the blood of almost every Indian, and we have a history of businessmen, and it was suppressed between 47 and 90. It was certainly not encouraged. In fact, one of my Swedish friends talked about in India, entrepreneurship grows is like greenery through asphalt, breaks through those walls and grows still. It was also the period when global strategy became relevant to Indian business. Mergers and acquisitions, there was a cultural value that somehow it was a sin to take over another company. It was unfair. The sympathy was always with the underdog. But I think the country slowly accepted the idea that there are two kinds of markets, one for products and services and one now for businesses. It is quite fair and desirable that incompetent management should be threatened and they reform, or they get bought out and the resources get utilized better. So domestic M&A and incoming M&A, and more recently in the last 5-10 years, Indian companies acquiring assets abroad. Not every M&A succeeds. It's not a guarantee, but at least the strategic option is now open. There has been much more professionalization of management, and one of my great satisfactions looking back the last 45 years that I've been back here, working initially with institutes of management and later as a kind of an independent resource, not a formally appointed national professor, but an informally accepted resource person for all kinds of institutions and platforms, is that we see great professionalization. I have been advocating two kinds of hybrid personalities which are desperately needed in India. One for the family owners, second, third generation successors like Anand Mahindra, Ambani's and so on, how to be a professional entrepreneur. That although you are an entrepreneur, also be a professional, and many of them are now, highly qualified, exposed to management ideas, attending very good programs abroad and conferences like Davos. And on the managerial side, I've been advocating that Indian managers cannot leave all entrepreneurship to either business families or to civil servants and ministers who think of new investment projects, but themselves they must become intrapreneurial professionals. They are not owners, but they are the internal entrepreneurs, and I think this is happening in a great deal of cases. The family is too thin on the ground, therefore there are internal owners of many businesses who are in effect the entrepreneurs taking their companies forward. And this is a very good marriage. We have overcome two kinds of historical problems. I think 1857 to 1947, 90 years, was a golden period where there was a great deal of harmony and understanding between the freedom fighters, who were the eventual politicians, and Indian business. There was a common objective of throwing the colonial regime out and taking over the future of the country. But between 47 and 91, we have a suppression of this entrepreneurship, and we have rediscovered that capability, and also a great deal of stress on institution building. Now, 2008, the great global recession, there is a worldwide groping and looking for answers. Okay, in the scorecard, I'd like to mention that we are a credible democracy worldwide. There is a sustained amount of moderate growth, nothing to match the Chinese or our own potential, continuously underperforming economy. We have a huge entrepreneurial professional class now, huge manpower, and also high expectations from the world. We are constantly disappointing them. Despite that, there are renewed expectations. Okay, there are many challenges. The single biggest factor that is holding back Indian growth and development is infrastructure. We are way behind China, and the gap is only increasing. We are very low on human development indices, behind Bangladesh, behind even sub-Saharan Africa on some parameters of infant mortality and malnutrition and so on. The problem is poor federal governments. There are half a dozen states which are reasonably well governed, and many more are looking at their model, will improve. And we have new challenges now coming up, particularly climate change and terrorism. India is the softest world target in terrorism, and also India will have the maximum problem on climate change, independent of what other countries do. Chinese have a huge climate change modification program. We have a vulnerable 3,000-mile coastline, rising sea levels, and what happened in Uttarakhand would look like a tea party when this climate change really affects India. And I'd like to conclude with this way forward. I think we have improved management in Indian industry, both family-owned and government, also in the public sector. There is a great deal of improvement in the NGO sector. Management ideas have percolated into many aspects of Indian society. We need to improve public management. There are some civil servants, some managers who are aware of this, who are receptive. We need to improve the already known economic reforms have to be implemented. No great new ideas are needed. The political parties have to internally improve. We have only 2 professional parties in the country. The rest are all dynastic. We have to build more Indian MNCs with global competitive competence. I think all ideas in flux. I consciously avoided using competitive advantage. There is this new book which talks about the end of competitive advantage. And we are now engaged in the task National Skill Development Corporation, something we have left behind. The question has been already raised, whether it's democratic dividend or a nightmare. And we have to keep learning from all countries, but I think the single most important benchmark for India now is China. And if we simply took their good ideas and improved our governance and implemented, especially in the area of infrastructure, project management, if we were to identify within management the single biggest weakness of this economy, it is incompetent project management. Just to take one example, how China staged the 2008 Olympics, spectacular, and we have difficulty with Commonwealth Games. Thank you very much.